This podcast is brought to you thanks to the generous support of Whistler Blackcomb, leaders in delivering adventure.
We talked about what we were going to do if some rockfall come down, and I'm thinking, man, I'm being pretty paranoid here. Like, did I really need to do all that? Was it really necessary to discuss that? Like, nothing's moving in this whole valley. The snow is just right. I've got great footing. I'm feeling pretty good about where I am and what I'm doing with these people, and so are they. And I hear a clatter. And I look up, and there's a bunch of rocks coming down.
Welcome to Delivering Adventure. This is the podcast that explores what it really takes to share adventure like a pro, with your friends, your family, and as a profession. My name is Chris Capio, and I'm coming to you from Whistler, British Columbia.
And I'm Jordy Shepard, recording from Canmore, Alberta. After a lifetime of working extensively in different parts of the adventure guiding industry, Chris and I have teamed up to launch this podcast. In each episode, you will hear top adventure guides, managers, marketers, and athletes share their best stories, advice, and trade secrets. The goal of this podcast is to share how you can take yourself and others farther from the mountains to the office and beyond.
As we've discussed many times on this show, adventures have risks. It doesn't matter how much you plan or how well you manage situations. If you're having an adventure, something can go wrong. It's impossible to make adventures 100% safe. If they really are safe, then there isn't any risk, which means they aren't going to be adventures. For this reason, planning for mishaps, emergencies, and surprises is another essential step when it comes to delivering adventure. In this episode, we're going to share a story from ACMG Alpine guide and professional athlete Will Gadd to highlight the importance of planning for mishap. Will's story takes place on the Fuhrmann Ledges in Banff National Park and is an excellent example of the value of planning for mishaps, even when you think there is a low risk of something going wrong. Will Gadd has joined us a number of times on the show already to share his thoughts on how to avoid misadventure, decision-making, and risk communication. Will Gadd is a world-class climbing, paragliding, and whitewater kayaking athlete. In addition to undertaking many adventures around the world, Will also guides others professionally. Will has a long list of accomplishments, including first ice climbing ascents of Niagara Falls and on Mount Kilamjaro, winning 3 gold medals at the X Games, and setting the paragliding world distance record twice. After we share Will's story, we will break down some of the key takeaways that can help all of us to deliver safer adventures. Jordy, before we share Will's story, could you set the stage for us by telling us about the Fuhrmann Ledges, which is the location of this story?
Sure, Chris. There's actually a long-standing history of that route. It goes back to Peter Fuhrmann, who was a park warden and alpine specialist, running rescue programs and training for Parks Canada quite a while ago. Well-known mountain guide in the Rockies. I'll just read from the Alpine Club of Canada's old approach description to the Abbott Pass hut. This is one of the ways to get to the hut there. And the Abbott Pass hut is now no longer. It lasted about 100 years, almost exactly. And climate change took the ice out from underneath it on the moraine that it was sitting on, and it had to be removed. So the Fuhrmann Ledges approach and descent to and from Abbott Pass hut is an alternative to the dangers of the Death Trap, which is down below and quite a bit more spicy as a approach. This route provides a slightly safer, albeit more circuitous route to the pass, or more commonly back to the lake, and that would be to Lake Louise. It incorporates portions of what was known as the old Swiss guides route. However, the terrain has changed substantially since the beginning of the century. The first recorded use of this route in modern times was by Peter Fuhrmann while guiding an Alpine Club Rockies Panorama hiking camp down from the pass in 1991, a trip on which the participants surely got their money's worth. A trip up this route in early season would have the advantage of snow covering the scree cone on the east face of Mount Lefroy, possibly providing more secure footing. However, the upper west slopes of Lefroy get the afternoon sun, and in the early season, there's a greater possibility of debris falling from above as you traverse the final trails and ledges to the pass. So this is up above the Plain of Six Glaciers, Tea House Trail, as you're going up, hiking up from Lake Louise towards the Plain of Six. Just a quick reminder, if you've not already done so, please make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You can find our social media links and an easily shareable link for your friends in the show notes. Here's Will Gadd.
Yeah, no, I mean the Fuhrmann Ledges. I've had enough incidents like or near misses where I've really started to believe in in communicating clearly about things. But that Fuhrmann Ledges day is a good example of that sort of process and work. I had a couple of guests who were going climbing on an alpine route, and it was a relatively um, cold day. Things seemed really good to do what we're doing. Cloudy, which is even better. I had backup plans for the day if it wasn't going well, and I felt like I'd really done a lot of good sort of planning for that day. But we're going up to a section of this route that I had previously had a little bit of rockfall on, and I was concerned about it. Again, it seemed like an ideal day. It's cloudy. It's got all the things going for it that make it reasonable to be there in my mind. But there is still hazard there of rockfall, and I talked about that with my guests. I said, "Hey, I'm going to walk in there with you. I'm not walking in there if I think this is coming down right now, but I have seen rockfall here before, and if that happens, um, first of all, do you even want to go in here? Like, is this a reasonable thing to be doing?" And one of them is quite experienced in the mountains, and said, "Yeah, there's no debris on the snow. This actually looks really good, and nothing's moving around." They had some experience, and so that seemed reasonable to them as well. But so off we go. We go marching up the snow slope, and we talked about what we were going to do if we did have some rock fall come down. And I'm thinking, man, I'm being pretty paranoid here. Like, did I really need to do all that? Was it really necessary to discuss that? Like, nothing's moving in this whole valley. The snow is just right. I've got great footing. This is I'm feeling pretty good about where I am and what I'm doing with these people. And so are they. And I hear a clatter. And I look up and there's a bunch of rocks coming down. And, we talked about what to do. And the people I was with hadn't seen this yet. And I'm watching them. Are they just going to go by the side of us and be harmless? And you got to kind of watch it. But we had talked about what we were going to do. And I said, I'm going to call a direction and we're going to move that direction. And so I made that call and I said, hey, rockfall, we're going right. And we moved. And unfortunately, one of them was hit in the arm with a pretty good rock. On the other hand, if we'd been standing where we had been, I or one of them would have been hit directly with one of those rocks. And it was not a good outcome. We have a broken arm and we're pretty high up in the mountains. It's not a good outcome at all. But to their credit, both of these people were like, hey, we talked about this. It could have just as easily been you hit with the rock. I'd done a lot of training in short roping that was way in some ways over the top to be able to hold those two people in a short rope situation. I'd done some very positive limit setting or limit testing, getting back to that idea. And I was able to do enough things right so that when they went bad, it worked out. But had I not discussed that with them going in there, and had I not done that training, and had I not at least been aware that that was a possibility and shared that, first of all, the outcome could have been a lot worse, right? If I just gone in there, we're charging, we're good. Nothing's going to happen today. So that was good risk communication. In retrospect, I did some things that day that I learned from. I went home and stewed a long time about that. And I think relatively cold, which is how I started that, was not actually as cold as I needed it to be. And I wrote the first ever ACMG incident report. And I shared it publicly because I want this communication to begin. And then an odd thing happened. About 5 other guides emailed me and said, I had something happen like that 2 weeks earlier. I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me about it? And this comes back to a lot of the stuff that I'm working on, trying to take some standards from different industries, such as information sharing, and get them more into our outdoor delivering adventure world. Dealing with catastrophic things. Like I've really been pushing to have Reco in, in all of the alpine clothing from Arc'teryx, which it does now. And BD harnesses now have Reco in them. And Scarpa's new 6,000 meter boots have Reco in them. So it comes to both dealing with the aftermath and trying to do a good job leading up to it. I think I missed some things that day where I had that incident, and one of my guests got a broken arm as a result of that. On the other hand, we did enough things right, and we discussed it in a way that made that outcome seem more reasonable. So, but that was one of the key points in my career where I'm like, all right, I'm really glad I had that paranoid discussion. I remember thinking that it's like, do I really need to do this? Like, nothing's going to move here. And I was so damn glad on the backside that we talked about it, because it could have saved our lives. They weren't totally like, rockfall? What do you mean rockfall? They were like, we're moving, man. And they did. And it was good. And yeah. And then how do we make it better on the back end? What can we do as an industry?
So Jordy, what came to mind as you listened to Will's story?
Well, Chris, there are a lot of things that were definitely done very well. Let's start with the idea of communicating risks. This includes Will communicating what could happen to his clients and himself. In this instance, it's a given that Will would have had his clients sign a waiver and would have talked to them beforehand about the risks they could face. We can safely assume, based on how he described his risk communication process in previous episodes, that he checked in with his guests to make sure that they were okay with the level of risk they were going to be exposed to. An important part of communicating the risks was discussing the plan if the group encountered rockfall. This put the idea in their heads that rockfall could happen. More importantly, it helped them to prepare for the moment when it actually did happen. Like Will said, instead of having to use precious time to explain to them what they needed to do to get out of the way of the falling rock, he could simply just tell them to move to the side. Because he had already briefed them, they didn't have to ask why they needed to make that move. It became automatic. This underlines the importance of practicing for failure or mishap. The old adage is, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And then next up was being situationally aware. Even though Will felt that there wasn't a high probability of rockfall, he still went through the process of preparing everyone, looking for signs that rockfall had occurred recently and encouraging his clients to do the same. This is an instance where a less experienced person may have become complacent in believing that rockfall was not likely to happen due to the cold temperatures. All of this highlights the importance of not skipping steps. Even though Will felt good about the situation he was exposing his group to, he still checked every box. Chris, what came to you as you listened to Will's story?
First off, Jordy, I agree with all the points you raised. I'm going to add 2 more points. The first one has to do with what are known as the 5 hazardous attitudes. The FAA, or Federal Aviation Authority in the US, has identified 5 hazardous attitudes that pilots need to be aware of. The FAA has found that at least one of these attitudes is present in the human-caused airline accidents they investigate. These hazardous attitudes are anti-authority. This is the don't tell me what to do mindset. Impulsivity. This is the skipping steps or rushing mindset. Macho. So this is the if it happens, I can handle it mindset. Invulnerability. This is the it's not going to happen to me mindset. And resignation. This is the if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, and there is nothing I can do about it mindset. Listening to Will's story, you can make a pretty convincing case in how this is actually a case study in managing hazardous attitudes. By being methodical and not skipping steps, as Jordy mentioned, Will avoided adopting the impulsivity attitude. By being realistic about the consequences of his group getting hit by a rock, Will avoided the macho attitude. By building trust with his group and educating them as to why they would need to move to the side if he instructed them to, Will was able to avoid having his clients adopt the anti-authority mindset. While getting out of the way of the falling rock seems like the obvious thing to do in that moment, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people hesitate to do what they've been asked to do because they don't want to be told what to do. Lastly is resignation. By adopting a proactive mindset where Will did everything he could to prepare for any surprises or mishaps, he avoided falling into the resignation trap. When it comes to avoiding a resignation mindset, Will adopted the frame of mind that he was going to control what he could control. At its core, this is actually what this podcast promotes. We want to encourage people to take risks that make their lives more fulfilling, but to manage these risks in a way that gives people the best chance of success. When we take risks, we are essentially gambling. By being methodical and paying attention to the little details around communicating risk and planning for a mishap, we'll stack the odds in his favor. The second point I wanted to highlight centers around how people may react in the face of imminent danger. Luckily for Will, his group didn't hesitate to move when the rock came down the wall. There's a good chance that Will wouldn't have taken them there if he was concerned that they may not have reacted that way in that situation. While it's important to go over what to do in an emergency, leaders shouldn't underestimate how hard it is to know how people will react when they are faced with danger. I can tell you firsthand that when I tell people what they will need to do if their canoe flips on a mountain stream, that they are unlikely to remember my instructions if they go into the ice cold water. In that moment, they're going to be suffering from cold shock and are likely going to be struggling to get air in their lungs. Unless they are really resilient or I have them practice being in the water, I cannot know for sure how they will react in an emergency. So, while it's important to educate people on what to do if things go sideways, expect to have to do it multiple times and to be thorough because people forget things, and you can't know for sure how they will react when they are under stress. For more on this topic, you can check out Andre Jean Maillet's episodes earlier this season on how to perform in a crisis.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks very much to Will for sharing his story. If you would like to learn more about Will's work as a United Nations mountain hero, join him on a guided trip, hire him to be your instructor, or have him speak at your event, you can reach him through his website, willgadd.com. That's 2Ds in GADD.com. We will post this link as well as links to his TEDx talk and a few other videos in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. The more people we can get listening to our show, the more content we can bring you. Thanks for listening.